The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second bringing her closer to the moment she had been waiting for, dreading and anticipating in equal measure for the past 5 years. Aaliyah sat motionless on the edge of her bed, her dark eyes fixed on the calendar hanging on the opposite wall. The date was circled in thick, angry red ink. June 15th, 2025. Today was the day her husband would be released from San Quentin State Prison. To the world, it might have seemed like a day of celebration, a family reunited after years of separation. But for Aaliyah, it marked the beginning of a carefully orchestrated plan. A plan born from grief, nurtured by rage, and about to be executed with cold, calculated precision. As the first rays of the California sun crept through her bedroom window, Aaliyah's mind drifted back to that fateful day 5 years ago. The day her world shattered. The day her precious 2-year-old daughter, Zuri, was taken from her forever. The day she discovered the unthinkable truth about the man she had loved and trusted above all others. With a deep breath, Aaliyah stood up, her resolve hardening. Today, justice would be served. Today, she would make him pay for what he did to their little girl. The summer heat in Oakland, California, was oppressive, seeming to trap the city in a suffocating embrace. But inside the modest 2-bedroom apartment on the corner of 14th and Jefferson, the atmosphere was even more stifling. Aaliyah paced the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She had called her husband's workplace for the 3rd time that day, and for the 3rd time, she was told he had left early, citing a family emergency. But there was no emergency, at least not one that Aaliyah knew about. Her eyes darted to the clock on the wall. 6:45 p.m. Zuri's bedtime was approaching, and still, there was no sign of him. This wasn't like him. Despite their recent arguments and the growing distance between them, he had always made it home in time to tuck their daughter in. As if on cue, a small voice called out from the bedroom, "Mama? Where's Daddy?" Aaliyah forced a smile onto her face as she walked into the room. Zuri sat on her little bed, her favorite stuffed elephant clutched tightly to her chest. Her big brown eyes, so much like her father's, looked up at Aaliyah with innocent curiosity. "Daddy's just running a little late, baby," Aaliyah said, sitting down next to her daughter and pulling her close. "He'll be home soon." But as the hours ticked by and night fell, Aaliyah's worry turned to anger, and then to fear. This wasn't just a case of staying out late or forgetting to call. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. It wasn't until the next morning, as Aaliyah was preparing Zuri's breakfast, that the knock on the door came. 2 police officers stood in the hallway, their faces grim. "Mrs. Johnson?" one of them asked. "We need to speak with you about your husband." The words that followed would forever be etched in Aaliyah's memory. Arrested. Suspicion of embezzlement. Millions of dollars. Company funds. Under investigation for months. As the officers continued to explain, Aaliyah felt as if she were underwater, their voices muffled and distant. How could this be happening? How could she not have known? But it was the final revelation that brought her world crashing down around her. "Ma'am, there's more," the younger officer said, his voice softening. "We have reason to believe that some of the embezzled funds were used to purchase illegal substances, specifically cocaine." Aaliyah's mind reeled. Cocaine? Her husband? The man she had built a life with? The father of her child? It seemed impossible, like a cruel joke. But as the shock began to wear off, pieces started falling into place. The late nights, the mood swings, the increasing paranoia and irritability. As the officers left, promising to return with more information, Aaliyah sank to the floor, her back against the closed door. How would she explain this to Zuri? How would they survive this scandal, this betrayal? Little did she know, the worst was yet to come. In the days that followed her husband's arrest, Aaliyah's life became a whirlwind of police interviews, lawyer consultations, and endless questions from friends, family, and neighbors. She felt like she was living in a nightmare, desperately trying to shield Zuri from the harsh reality of their new situation. But it was during one of these chaotic days that Aaliyah noticed something that would change everything. She had been cleaning out her husband's home office, searching for any documents that might help his case, when she came across a small, unmarked USB drive tucked away in the back of a drawer. Curious, and admittedly hoping for some answers, Aaliyah plugged it into her laptop. What she found made her blood run cold. The drive contained hundreds of photos and videos, all featuring young children in various states of undress or in compromising positions. With trembling hands, Aaliyah clicked through the files, her horror growing with each image. And then, in a folder labeled simply Z, she saw it. A video thumbnail showing a familiar pink bedroom. Zuri's bedroom. For a moment, Aaliyah couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Her finger hovered over the thumbnail, her mind screaming at her not to click, to throw the laptop away, to pretend she had never found this drive. But she had to know. She had to see. With a shaky click, the video began to play. The next few minutes were a blur of horror and disbelief. Aaliyah watched, paralyzed, as her husband, the man she had loved, the father of her child, committed unspeakable acts against their 2-year-old daughter. Zuri's cries, muffled but unmistakable, filled the room. When the video ended, Aaliyah ran to the bathroom and violently emptied the contents of her stomach. She collapsed on the cold tile floor, her body racked with sobs. How long had this been going on? How could she not have known? How could she have failed to protect her baby girl? As the initial shock began to subside, a new emotion took its place. Rage. A burning, all-consuming anger that threatened to swallow her whole. In that moment, as Aaliyah picked herself up off the bathroom floor, a decision was made. Her husband would pay for what he had done. No matter how long it took, no matter what she had to do, he would suffer for the pain he had inflicted on their innocent child. With shaking hands, Aaliyah picked up her phone and dialed 911. As she waited for the operator to answer, she steeled herself for what was to come. The investigation, the trial, the media circus, she would endure it all. For Zuri, for justice. And when it was all over, when he was safely behind bars, she would begin planning her revenge. The Oakland courthouse stood imposing against the clear blue sky, its stone facade a silent witness to countless tales of justice and injustice. Today, it would bear witness to one of the most shocking and heartbreaking cases in recent memory. Aaliyah sat rigid in the front row of the courtroom, her eyes fixed on the back of her husband's head as he sat at the defense table. She had refused to speak to him since his arrest, declined every visit, torn up every letter. The man sitting just a few feet away from her was a stranger now, a monster wearing the face of the person she had once loved. As the bailiff called the court to order and the judge took his seat, Aaliyah felt a hand squeeze hers. She turned to see her mother, Evelyn, sitting beside her, a pillar of strength in the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The state of California versus Jamal Johnson, the clerk announced, her voice echoing in the hushed courtroom. The trial that followed was a grueling ordeal. Day after day, Aaliyah sat through testimony detailing her husband's crimes. Financial experts laid out the complex web of his embezzlement scheme, tracing millions of dollars that had been siphoned from his company over the course of several years. But it was the testimony regarding the abuse that truly tested Aaliyah's resolve. Computer forensics experts described in clinical detail the contents of the USB drive she had found. Child psychologists spoke about the potential long-term effects of abuse on young children. And then, most heart-wrenching of all, was Aaliyah's own testimony. As she took the stand, Aaliyah felt as if she were outside of her own body, watching herself from a distance as she recounted the day she discovered the truth. Her voice, steady at first, began to shake as she described the video she had found. "And you're certain it was your husband in the video?" the prosecutor asked gently. Aaliyah's eyes locked with Jamal's for the first time since the trial began. In that moment, she saw not remorse or shame, but a flicker of something else, defiance, perhaps even a hint of a smirk. It made her blood boil. "Yes," she said, her voice gaining strength, "I am absolutely certain it was him." Throughout the trial, Jamal maintained his innocence, his defense team arguing that the embezzlement was the work of a colleague who had set him up, and that the abuse allegations were a terrible misunderstanding. But the evidence was overwhelming. After weeks of testimony and arguments, the jury took less than 6 hours to reach a verdict. As the foreman stood to deliver their decision, Aaliyah held her breath. "On the charge of embezzlement, we find the defendant, Jamal Johnson, guilty." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Aaliyah's grip on her mother's hand tightened. On the charge of possession of child pornography, we find the defendant guilty. Tears began to roll down Aaliyah's cheeks, but she remained silent, waiting for the final verdict. On the charge of sexual abuse of a minor, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in a cacophony of gasps, cries, and the furious scribbling of reporters' pens. But Aaliyah heard none of it. All she could focus on was Jamal, who had turned to look at her, his face a mask of shock and anger. In that moment, as their eyes met across the courtroom, Aaliyah made a silent vow. This verdict was just the beginning. True justice, the kind that the courts couldn't provide, was still to come. As the judge called for order and prepared to announce the sentencing date, Aaliyah allowed herself a small, grim smile. 5 years, the lawyers had told her. With good behavior, he could be out in 5 years. 5 years to plan. 5 years to prepare. 5 years until she could make him truly pay for what he had done to their daughter. The countdown had begun. In the weeks following the trial, Aaliyah found herself adrift in a sea of conflicting emotions. Relief battled with anger, vindication with a deep, aching sadness. The life she had known, the future she had planned, had been shattered beyond repair. As the media frenzy surrounding the case began to die down, Aaliyah was left to pick up the pieces of her broken life. The first order of business was Zuri. While the little girl had been too young to fully understand what was happening during the trial, the absence of her father and the sudden changes in their life had not gone unnoticed. Aaliyah threw herself into caring for Zuri, determined to create a safe, loving environment for her daughter to heal and grow. She found a child psychologist specializing in trauma, and together they began the delicate process of helping Zuri process her experiences in an age-appropriate way. But even as she focused on Zuri's well-being, Aaliyah couldn't shake the anger that simmered just beneath the surface. Every night, after tucking Zuri into bed, she would sit at her kitchen table, a notebook open in front of her, and begin to plan. At first, her ideas were wild, fueled by rage and the desire for immediate retribution. But as the days turned to weeks and weeks to months, her plans began to take on a more calculated, methodical nature. Aaliyah knew that if she wanted her revenge to be truly satisfying, it needed to be perfect. She couldn't risk getting caught, couldn't risk leaving Zuri alone. No, this had to be planned with precision, executed flawlessly. As she plotted, Aaliyah began to make changes in her life. She enrolled in self-defense classes, building her strength and confidence. She took online courses in psychology, studying the intricacies of the human mind. She even began volunteering at a local prison, ostensibly to help with rehabilitation programs, but in reality to learn about the system from the inside. Each new skill, each piece of knowledge was carefully filed away, another tool in her growing arsenal of revenge. But even as she prepared for the day of Jamal's release, life went on. Zuri started school, making friends and slowly coming out of her shell. Aaliyah found a new job, throwing herself into her work with a determination that impressed her colleagues. To the outside world, she appeared to be healing, moving on with her life. Only Aaliyah's mother, Evelyn, sensed that something wasn't quite right. She noticed the hardness in her daughter's eyes, the way her smile never quite reached them anymore. But whenever she tried to broach the subject, Aaliyah would deflect, changing the subject to Zuri's latest accomplishment or asking about Evelyn's garden. As the first anniversary of the trial approached, Aaliyah received a letter. The return address made her heart race. It was from the prison where Jamal was being held. For a long moment, she stared at the envelope, debating whether to open it or simply throw it away. Finally, with trembling hands, she tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Jamal's familiar handwriting. Aaliyah, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I needed to reach out. I've had a lot of time to think in here, about what I've done, about the pain I've caused you and Zuri. I know saying sorry isn't enough, will never be enough, but I am sorry. More than you can ever know. I'm getting help here. Therapy, support groups. I'm trying to understand why I did what I did, trying to become a better person. I know I can never make up for what I've done, but I want you to know that I'm trying. I miss you both so much. I know I have no right to ask, but if you could find it in your heart to forgive me someday, to let me be a part of Zuri's life again, I love you both. Jamal. Aaliyah read the letter once, twice, 3 times. Then, with deliberate slowness, she walked to the kitchen, pulled out a lighter, and set the paper aflame. She watched as the words curled and blackened until nothing was left but ashes. As she washed the ashes down the sink, Aaliyah felt a sense of calm settle over her. Any doubts she might have had about her plan vanished. Jamal's words of remorse, whether genuine or not, changed nothing. He had made his choices, and now he would face the consequences. 4 more years, she thought to herself. 4 more years to prepare, to become the instrument of justice that Zuri deserved. The countdown continued. Time has a way of changing people, of reshaping them into something new. For Aaliyah, the years following Jamal's imprisonment were a period of intense metamorphosis. The woman who emerged was a far cry from the trusting, optimistic person she had once been. As Zuri grew, blossoming into a bright, curious child, Aaliyah found herself living a double life. By day, she was the devoted mother, the hardworking employee, the pillar of strength that her family and friends had come to rely on. But by night, when Zuri was safely tucked away in bed, Aaliyah transformed into something else entirely. Her self-defense classes had evolved into intense martial arts training. What had started as a way to feel safer had become an obsession, a means of honing her body into a weapon. She spent hours in dimly lit dojos, learning to channel her anger and pain into precise, controlled movements. The psychology courses she had taken online led her down a rabbit hole of manipulation techniques and mind games. She devoured books on body language, on the art of reading people, on how to bend others to her will without them even realizing it. In her mind, she was preparing for a battle of wits with Jamal, determined to be 10 steps ahead at all times. Her volunteer work at the prison had given her invaluable insights into the system, but it had also exposed her to a world she had never known existed. She learned about prison hierarchies, about the unwritten rules that governed life behind bars. More importantly, she learned about the challenges that awaited inmates upon their release. The struggle to find employment, to reintegrate into society, to stay on the straight and narrow. All of this knowledge, all of these skills were carefully filed away, pieces of a puzzle that was slowly taking shape in Aaliyah's mind. But perhaps the most significant change was the one that took place within Aaliyah's heart. The warm, loving woman she had once been was buried deep, replaced by someone colder, more calculating. She still loved Zuri fiercely, would still do anything to protect her daughter, but that love had taken on a harder edge. Aaliyah's mother, Evelyn, watched this transformation with growing concern. She saw the light in her daughter's eyes dim, saw the way her smiles became rarer and less genuine. But every time she tried to talk to Aaliyah about it, she was met with deflection or outright dismissal. "I'm fine, Mama," Aaliyah would say, her voice carrying a hint of steel that brooked no argument. "I'm just focused on giving Zuri the best life possible." But Evelyn wasn't fooled. She recognized the signs of a soul consumed by vengeance, having seen it before in her own mother after Evelyn's father had abandoned them. She feared for Aaliyah, for the path she seemed determined to walk. As the 3rd year of Jamal's sentence drew to a close, Evelyn decided it was time for a direct confrontation. She invited Aaliyah over for dinner one evening, sending Zuri to stay with a friend so they could talk privately. Over a meal of Aaliyah's childhood favorites, fried chicken, collard greens, and sweet potato pie, Evelyn broached the subject. "Baby," she said, reaching across the table to take Aaliyah's hand. "I'm worried about you. This thing you're doing, this person you're becoming, it's not you." Aaliyah's eyes, usually so guarded now, flashed with a mix of emotions: surprise, defensiveness, and something darker. "What are you talking about, Mama? I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. I'm stronger now than I've ever been." Evelyn shook her head sadly. "Strength isn't about being hard, baby. It's about being able to bend without breaking. What you're doing, it's making you brittle. I'm afraid that one day you're going to shatter." For a moment, Aaliyah's carefully constructed facade cracked. Tears welled up in her eyes and her lower lip trembled. "You don't understand," she whispered. "What he did to Zuri, I can't just let that go. I can't." "I'm not asking you to let it go," Evelyn said gently. "But this path you're on, this obsession with revenge, it's not going to heal you, baby. It's not going to heal Zuri. All it's going to do is keep that wound open, keep the pain fresh." Aaliyah pulled her hand away, her eyes hardening once more. "You're wrong," she said, her voice cold. "This isn't about healing. It's about justice. Real justice, not that joke of a sentence he got." Evelyn sighed, realizing that her words weren't getting through. "Just promise me one thing," she said. "Before you do anything at all, think about Zuri. Think about what your actions might do to her. She needs her mama, Aaliyah. She needs you whole and present, not consumed by this darkness." For a long moment, Aaliyah was silent. Then, without a word, she stood up and walked out of the house, leaving her mother sitting alone at the dinner table. As she drove home that night, Aaliyah's mind was in turmoil. Part of her knew that her mother was right, that the path she was on was destructive. But a larger part, the part that woke her up in the middle of the night with visions of Zuri's tear-stained face, refused to let go of her plans for revenge. In the end, as she pulled into her driveway and saw the soft glow of Zuri's nightlight in her bedroom window, Aaliyah made a decision. She would continue with her plan, but she would be smarter about it. No more obvious changes, no more raising suspicions. From now on, her transformation would be internal, invisible to the outside world. As she walked into the house, greeted by the babysitter's cheerful goodbye and the sound of Zuri's soft breathing from her room, Aaliyah allowed herself a small, grim smile. 2 more years, she thought. 2 more years until Jamal's release. 2 more years to perfect her plan, to become the instrument of justice she knew she needed to be. The countdown continued, but now it had taken on a new urgency. Aaliyah knew she was racing not just against time, but against the possibility of losing herself completely to the darkness that had taken root in her heart. As the date of Jamal's release drew nearer, Aaliyah's life took on an almost manic intensity. To the outside world, she appeared to be thriving. She had received a promotion at work, Zuri was excelling in school, and she had even started dating again, much to the relief of her friends and family who had worried about her isolation. But beneath this carefully crafted veneer of normalcy, Aaliyah was making her final preparations. Every spare moment was dedicated to refining her plan, to anticipating every possible scenario and preparing for it. She had rented a small storage unit on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes. Inside, she had meticulously gathered everything she would need. Burner phones, cash withdrawn in small amounts over the course of months, a variety of disguises, and other items she had determined might be useful. Aaliyah had also been laying the groundwork for her alibi. She had booked a mother-daughter retreat at a resort several hours away for the week of Jamal's release. In reality, she planned to leave Zuri with her mother, using the excuse of a last-minute work emergency to explain her absence. As the final month before Jamal's release arrived, Aaliyah found herself struggling with increasing bouts of anxiety and doubt. The weight of what she was planning to do pressed down on her, making it difficult to sleep, to eat, to function normally. One night, about 3 weeks before the release date, Aaliyah found herself sitting on the edge of Zuri's bed, watching her daughter sleep. Zuri, now 7 years old, had grown into a beautiful, resilient child. Despite the trauma of her early years, she was thriving, a testament to the love and support she had received from Aaliyah and their family. As Aaliyah brushed a stray curl from Zuri's forehead, a wave of doubt washed over her. Was she doing the right thing? Was her desire for revenge worth the risk of losing all of this, of losing Zuri? For a moment, she considered abandoning her plan. She could cancel the storage unit rental, dispose of the evidence, and truly move on with her life. She could focus on being there for Zuri, on healing, on building a future untainted by the specter of revenge. But then Zuri stirred in her sleep, her face contorting into a frown as she mumbled something unintelligible. Aaliyah knew that despite all the progress Zuri had made, the nightmares still came sometimes, shadowy, half-remembered terrors that left her daughter shaking and crying in the middle of the night. In that moment, Aaliyah's resolve hardened once more. This wasn't just about her pain, her desire for vengeance. It was about justice for Zuri, about making sure that the man who had hurt her could never do so again. With a soft kiss on Zuri's forehead, Aaliyah left the room. Her mind made up. She would see this through to the end, whatever the cost. The next few weeks passed in a blur of final preparations and barely contained anxiety. Aaliyah went through the motions of her daily life, working, caring for Zuri, socializing with friends, all while counting down the days, hours, minutes until Jamal's release. She had memorized his release date and time, had studied the layout of the prison and the surrounding area until she could navigate it in her sleep. She knew the exact route Jamal would likely take upon his release, the bus he would probably catch to return to Oakland. 2 days before the release date, Aaliyah sat Zuri down for a talk. She explained about the mother-daughter retreat, painting a picture of a fun-filled week of activities and bonding time. Zuri, excited by the prospect of a vacation, didn't question why they needed to leave so suddenly, or why they had never discussed it before. As Aaliyah packed Zuri's bag, carefully selecting her daughter's favorite clothes and toys, she felt a pang of guilt. She hated lying to Zuri, hated that she would be leaving her daughter during what was sure to be a confusing and potentially frightening time. But she consoled herself with the thought that it was necessary, that it was all part of ensuring Zuri's long-term safety and well-being. The night before Jamal's release, Aaliyah found herself unable to sleep. She paced her living room, going over her plan again and again, searching for any flaws, any overlooked details. As the first light of dawn began to creep through her windows, she finally allowed herself to rest, knowing that she would need all her strength and focus for what was to come. As she drifted off into a fitful sleep, Aaliyah's last conscious thought was of Zuri. Whatever happened in the coming days, she silently vowed it would all be for her daughter, for justice, for closure. The countdown was almost over. Tomorrow, everything would change. Chapter 7. The Day of Reckoning. June 15th, 2025 dawned bright and clear, the California sun rising over San Quentin State Prison with an almost mocking cheerfulness. Aaliyah had been awake for hours, her body thrumming with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She went through the motions of her morning routine mechanically, fixing breakfast for Zuri and packing the last of their things for the retreat. As she zipped up Zuri's little pink suitcase, adorned with cartoon characters, Aaliyah felt a lump form in her throat. She pushed down the emotion, reminding herself of why she was doing this. "You ready for our big adventure, baby girl?" Aaliyah asked, forcing a smile as Zuri bounced excitedly around the living room. "Yes, Mama, I can't wait," Zuri exclaimed, her eyes shining with innocent excitement. The drive to Evelyn's house was filled with Zuri's chatter about all the fun things she was going to do with her grandmother. Aaliyah responded with appropriate enthusiasm, all while her mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. As they pulled up to Evelyn's house, Aaliyah took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she knew would be a difficult goodbye. Evelyn was waiting on the porch, her face a mixture of concern and resignation. She had long since realized that she couldn't talk Aaliyah out of whatever she had planned, but that didn't stop her from worrying. "Now you be good for Grandma, okay?" Aaliyah said, kneeling down to hug Zuri tightly. "Mama's got some important work to do, but I'll be back before you know it." Zuri nodded, returning the hug with enthusiasm. "I will, Mama. I love you. I love you too, baby. More than anything in this world." Aaliyah whispered, fighting back tears. As Zuri skipped into the house, Evelyn approached Aaliyah. "You sure about this?" she asked quietly. Aaliyah nodded, her face set in determination. "I have to do this, Mama. For Zuri, for myself." Evelyn sighed, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. "Just be careful, baby, and remember, no matter what happens, you always have a home here. Both of you." With a final nod, Aaliyah got back into her car and drove away, watching Evelyn and Zuri waving from the porch in her rearview mirror until they disappeared from sight. As soon as she was out of view of her mother's house, Aaliyah pulled over and changed into the clothes she had stashed in her trunk. Nondescript jeans, a plain t-shirt, and a baseball cap to shadow her face. She then drove to the storage unit, where she swapped her car for a nondescript rental she had arranged weeks ago. By the time Aaliyah arrived at San Quentin, parking in a spot with a clear view of the main gate, it was mid-morning. She settled in to wait, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure anyone passing by would hear it. At precisely 11:30 a.m., the gate opened. Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat as she saw him for the first time in 5 years. Jamal looked older, his face lined with the stress of his imprisonment, but there was a spring in his step as he walked out of the prison gates, a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Aaliyah watched as Jamal made his way to the bus stop just outside the prison. She knew his plan. He would take the bus to the nearest train station, then the train back to Oakland. She had memorized his route, had driven it multiple times to ensure she knew every turn, every potential delay. As Jamal boarded the bus, Aaliyah started her car, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. This was it. There was no turning back now. She followed the bus at a discreet distance, her mind racing with the details of her plan. She had considered every possibility, had prepared for every contingency. But now that the moment was here, she felt a flicker of doubt. Could she really go through with this? The bus ride seemed to last both an eternity and no time at all. Before Aaliyah knew it, they were pulling into the train station. She parked her car and watched as Jamal disembarked, looking around with a mixture of wariness and hope on his face. As he made his way to the ticket counter, Aaliyah took a deep breath and stepped out of her car. This was the moment she had been preparing for 5 long years. With steady steps, she approached Jamal, her hand reaching into her pocket where a small, carefully prepared syringe waited. Just as she was about to reach him, a child's laughter rang out across the station. Aaliyah froze, the sound reminding her so strongly of Zuri that for a moment she couldn't breathe. In that instant of hesitation, Jamal turned, his eyes widening as he recognized her despite her disguise. "Aaliyah?" he gasped, his voice a mixture of surprise and something else. Fear? Remorse? Aaliyah couldn't tell. Time seemed to stand still as they stared at each other, the bustling train station fading away around them. In Jamal's eyes, Aaliyah saw a kaleidoscope of emotions: regret, hope, fear, and underneath it all, a deep, abiding sadness. In that moment, as she stood on the precipice of enacting her long-planned revenge, Aaliyah felt something shift inside her. The weight of the past 5 years, the anger, the pain, the all-consuming desire for vengeance, it all came crashing down on her at once. With trembling hands, she pulled the syringe from her pocket and let it clatter to the ground. Jamal's eyes followed its fall, understanding dawning on his face as he realized what she had been planning to do. "I'm so sorry," Jamal whispered, his voice breaking. "For everything. I know it doesn't change anything, but I am so sorry." Aaliyah felt tears begin to stream down her face, years of pent-up emotion finally breaking free. "How could you?" she choked out. "How could you do that to her? To us?" Jamal shook his head, his own eyes filling with tears. "I don't know," he said softly. "I've asked myself that every day for the past 5 years. I was sick, Aaliyah. So sick. But that's no excuse. What I did, there's no excuse for that." As they stood there, 2 broken people in the middle of a busy train station, Aaliyah felt the last of her resolve crumble. She had come here seeking revenge. Aaliyah realized that the true prison had been the one she had built for herself over the past 5 years. The walls of anger and resentment that she had carefully constructed were crumbling, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable, but also strangely free. "I can't forgive you," Aaliyah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not yet, maybe not ever, but I can't do this either. I can't become the very thing I've hated for so long." Jamal nodded, understanding and acceptance in his eyes. "I know. I don't expect forgiveness. I want you to know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make amends, not just to you and Zuri, but to everyone I've hurt. I know it's not enough, but it's all I can do." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Then, without another word, Aaliyah turned and walked away. She didn't look back, but she could feel Jamal's eyes on her as she left the station. As she drove back to her mother's house, Aaliyah felt a strange mix of emotions. The anger that had fueled her for so long was still there, but it no longer consumed her. In its place was a tentative sense of peace, a realization that by choosing not to act on her revenge, she had freed herself from its grip. When she arrived at her mother's house, Zuri ran out to greet her, confusion evident on her little face. "Mama, I thought you had important work to do?" Aaliyah knelt down, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. "I did, baby, the most important work of all. I learned that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to let go of our anger and choose to heal instead." As they walked into the house, Evelyn waiting on the porch with a knowing look in her eyes, Aaliyah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be difficult conversations with Zuri, therapy sessions, and a long process of healing for all of them. But for the first time in 5 years, Aaliyah felt hope for the future. She had waited 5 years for this day, planning her revenge down to the smallest detail. But in the end, she had chosen a different path. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a step towards healing. And as she held Zuri close, surrounded by the love of her family, Aaliyah knew that this was the true victory. Not over Jamal, but over the darkness that had threatened to consume her. The story of Aaliyah and Jamal was far from over. But this chapter, the chapter of revenge and retribution, had come to an end. And in its place, a new chapter was beginning, one of healing, of growth, and of the long, difficult, but ultimately rewarding journey towards true justice and peace.